Good afternoon. Good. This is David Holcomb at River Oaks Discipleship. Pastor here with Senior Pastor David Beatty for our weekly one-story reflection, really a look back at the sermon yesterday, David. And yesterday we moved into one story from last week when Joshua to yesterday was in the book of Judges. And one of the first things that comes out of this conversation on Judges is you used one word yesterday over and over and over and over, and it was the word cycle.
Cycle.
What did you mean by that, or how do we think of that?
Well, there seems to be this repetitive cycle, something recurring repeatedly with the Israelites.
Okay.
They would abandon the Lord, and then the Lord would give them over and under the oppression of enemies. They'd cry out to the Lord would raise up a judge. The judge would deliver the people. But when the judge died, the people would again abandon the Lord, turn to idolatry. And this happened repeatedly, over and over and over and over, and seemed to be a cycle in the book of Judges.
And that really runs the entire book.
I think so.
And across, I think you mentioned yesterday, you also had the chart of the 12 judges, I think sometimes 13.
Right.
Progressively downward is sort of one way to look at it too, right?
I think, I can't cite the verse, but each time the judge died, the scripture says they would become more corrupt than their fathers. And so the corruption seemed to get worse and worse with the Israelites, their idolatry and the practices related to it.
And so this picture really, as I was listening to you and seeing these charts, was Joshua actually dies in the first of Judges, or there's reference to it.
Yeah.
So the story's continuing, the narrative.
Right.
And then there's these cycles of 12 or 13 judges downwardly for, do you see, I find mostly about 400 years? Or
I would say 300-400 years. You know, the judges, some ruled a very short time, 7-8 years, and some 40 to 80 years. So probably adds up to close to 400 years. 400
years, and that's really where the history of Israel continues in the narrative.
Right.
So what was the catalyst? I mean, Joshua reminded the people as they moved into the Promised Land, and for the most part there was great obedience and blessing.
Right.
We moved just to the end of Joshua's life, and then we move into Judges, and there was some catalyst for this now disobedience.
Yes. Well, Judges chapter 2 says Joshua died, he's 110 years old, and all the elders who had served with Joshua yet outlived him. They died, and then there arose a generation that did not know the Lord or the works he'd done for Israel. And the implication is they failed to transmit the knowledge of God to the next generation. And that seemed to be what set this cycle into place. Because when the judge died, each judge in the cycle, they followed more corrupt practices. So their big failure, I think, was the failure to teach their children, the next generation.
You know, one of the things I think is easy to do too is to point to the children and say, how could they?
Yeah.
But it was really the older generation.
Yeah, they failed them.
That was the failure.
Right.
Probably, I would assume, in word and in deed.
Yes.
The behavior was then transmitted on and transferred on. Well, through these cycles, the downward spiral, the 400 years, it gets worse and worse and worse. They're further away from God. The big question of Judges, man, they become violent.
Gosh,
just violence and violence and violence.
Yeah.
Bad stuff.
Yeah.
Why, or do you? I mean, that's the big question, right?
It is the big question.
Why so much?
And you know, it's one of these things. People look at this book of the Bible and go, how can an omnipotent God allow violence like this? I think the key is really found in the very last verse of the last chapter of Judges, which reads, I think it's Judges 21-25. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Judges is a picture of life without the right rulership, lordship, kingship, and really shows us our need for a perfect king, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, Jesus.
And that's the shadow or the foreshadowing of Jesus, really, that we can kind of see coming out of Judges.
I think so. I think that's one of the important things to take away from the book of Judges. It shows us our need for his rulership, his lordship, his kingship in our lives.
So do you think, so would we say that God commanded the violence, or did he allow the violence, or it was, because we know the books of history are that.
Right.
They're just recordings,
Right.
the good, the bad, the ugly.
Right.
And here's a lot of bad and ugly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's just, it is what happened, but it doesn't mean that God blessed it or
Caused it.
Or how do you?
I would prefer to say he allowed it,
Okay.
because the book of Judges says they abandoned the Lord,
Okay.
and the Lord gave them over to the hand of their enemies. In other words, he lifted his protective hand and allowed their enemies to oppress them and subdue them.
Okay.
And so it was their disobedience that precipitated that.
Okay.
So.
And really an indication of our depravity, just fallen
Yeah.
man, sinful man.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
perhaps recorded history of even our contemporary time will speak to the amount of violence and
Right. Right.
just how difficult that is to comprehend, really.
It is.
Well, and and I think one of the maybe the last comments or questions here is, you used a verse yesterday too that I thought really sort of spoke to how do you respond to someone that says, well, if it happened in Judges, God must have really wanted that to happen, and so there can't be a good God. Paul in 1 Corinthians
Yeah.
10,
Chapter 10.
chapter 10, can you remind us
Yeah.
or why did you choose
Yeah.
that
Well,
passage?
Twice in that passage, I think it's 1 Corinthians 10, verses 6 through 11, 10 or 11.
Okay.
He says, now these things happened to them, and these things is a reference to what happened in the Old Testament. He's
Right,
citing,
okay.
I think, from the book of Numbers. These things happened to them as examples, and they're written for our instruction upon whom the ends of the world have come. That is, these of us in later times. We're to learn from these things. And then he lists all these negative things, that we should not commit idolatry like they did, that we should not commit sexual immorality like they did, that we should not grumble or complain like they did. And so he's saying these examples are to teach us how not to live, how
Right.
not to disregard God, how not to disregard his will and his ways, and to turn to false gods.
And that's so important, particularly in the books of history, which we're now
Right.
in, is that God is not condoning every act.
Right, absolutely.
Because many of
Yeah.
them are disobedient,
Yeah.
sinful
Yeah.
acts.
They're acts that give us a picture of what life is like without being under God's lordship or
right.
rule.
Well, one maybe just a few other, because this is really intriguing. I hope you guys are enjoying the conversation on Judges, of all things, and we want to keep doing this. But that list of judges, and we
Yeah.
think about it being a downward spiral.
Right.
So we kind of had the first few judges that were okay, maybe Deborah, perhaps.
Yeah.
They had their flaws.
Right.
Gideon, perhaps, but he had his flaw.
Right.
But we work all the way down to the last one in Judges, Samson.
Samson. Yeah.
And I was thinking yesterday that maybe just that childhood, just misunderstanding, but it feels like we often think of Samson as a hero of the Bible.
Yeah. Yeah.
How would you respond?
Well,
to
we're
that?
introduced to
That's not-
Samson when he's going to a prostitute, I
Okay.
think. So, we can think of him as a hero, and God used him. He anointed him with great power, and ultimately, in his death, he killed a bunch of
Sure,
Philistines.
sure.
But if you look at his life, you have to say Samson was undisciplined and immoral and unwise, and yet God used him.
Yes, that's true.
So I would say God used Samson despite his
Right. Well, and
character.
he's really the epitome of what's going on, because
Right.
in defeating the Philistines or against them initially, he then actually becomes one. If you read it, I mean, it seems like he becomes sort of, he worships idols. With Delilah, he sort
Right.
of continues to go
Right.
back to her.
Right.
And you warned us about that yesterday. You said Judges, one of the key things it teaches us, aside from passing along to next generation, is the influence, not to be influenced and overtaken by
Right.
the culture
Right.
around us.
Right, absolutely. It's a great warning of the book of Judges. And we see this happening today. If people don't hold fast to some standard of truth from God, we will be changed. Our worldview, our morality will be changed by the surrounding culture. If we let it be driven by the media, by what friends think, we'll be pulled away. We need to hold steadfast to God and His Word.
Oh, that's great. That's a great word. It's anything else you would like to share on Judges, or I think we covered.
No,
that was good.
I think it would be hard to come up with more challenging questions than you can come up with.
Well,
But no, it's part of God's inspired Word. But as you mentioned before, just because it happened doesn't mean that God caused it to happen.
Right.
He's showing us what life is like when there's no rulership of a godly king, a good godly king. And ultimately, of course, we know that king is Jesus,
Right.
King of kings and Lord of lords.
well, good. So Judges. So this next week, next Sunday, we'll look at Ruth.
Right.
And
a little bit easier book.
that'll
to
be
deal with.
easier. And then
Yeah.
I think it's interesting as we get back, the narrative continues on the other side of Ruth, where we see the last of the judges, perhaps, with Eli and Samuel, and this sort of that continuation, and
Yeah.
we'll move into some kings.
Into the kings.
Yeah.
Yeah. David
Well,
and Saul.
Thank you, David, for sharing
Thank you,
that.
David.
I really
Thanks.
appreciate the teaching yesterday, and
Thank
we
you,
hope you all
guys.
have a wonderful week in the book of Judges.